Hi everyone, welcome back to Right Media. I'm Chamithu. This is Mesandu and Dinura. Today we'll be talking about media, which is a very vast topic. There are a lot of things that we can talk about media, and it is also one of the most important things we can talk about because it is media that actually influences the views and ideas of people. For example, everything that people see on social media, everything that people see on newspapers, on their TVs, and even on their phones, all of those things influence their views and opinions. But at the end of the day, don't you believe that media is just a business which tries to earn money by getting the most clicks?
Yes, absolutely. So, for example, during the recent days, we could see that during the Torrington murder, for example, most of the mass media showed the body of the victim without any censoring whatsoever, and the reason they did that can be obviously for clicks, right? Because they try to sell what is the most popular thing, and they try to get the shock factor in. So mass media may not always be the most ethical, and obviously it has its downsides.
Yes, so what you were saying is media sometimes does unethical things in order to get the most views. For example, showing the grieving family members of a murder victim. For example, I remember they showed a friend of the murder victim collapsing on the spot.
Absolutely.
So that is a very private moment for that person. So showing that in mainstream media where millions of people can see, that might be a very unethical thing, and you should think of how that person would feel when her breakdown is shown across the nation.
So we can also talk about the Easter Sunday bombings that happened in April. So we saw all the media in Sri Lanka showing the bloodshed that happened right after the bombing. They showed all the victims of the bombing on the floors, and so what I see over here is it's not very ethical to show the bombing, the victims. Therefore, I think it's not very practical. And
yes, so what you're saying is they always try to get the most clicks, the most views.
yes,
So they don't care about what it does to what they are showing, what it does to the people. They're just trying to get the most money.
because at the time it was the best selling news media wise, so therefore they should not have showed it.
Yeah, during the Easter attacks, they show the bloodshed, the decapitated heads, the bodies. So you must think about what people who are watching that news would feel. For example, if you're at home and you do not know what happened to one of your family members or a close friend who went to the churches, and when you suddenly see he saw her body on the news, you have to understand how that person would feel. But most mainstream media, it is unfortunate to know that they didn't even blur the faces or blur the damage and destruction that occurred. Is that what you're trying to say?
Absolutely, that is.
Yes, so media, you could always also say that media tries to paint everything in a negative picture, just because we can relate it to what you said before. They try to get the most clicks.
Yeah, so in this case I'm talking about Hambantota, where it is one of the best places to bring in FDIs, which is foreign direct investments, to Sri Lanka. So I think it's already a developed place where they have communication links, transport hubs, because there's an airport, there's a harbour, there's well developed roadways, and there's conference halls and hotels. So I think it's one of the best places to bring in FDIs and people to invest. But Sri Lankan media does not show the positive impacts of Hambantota, whereas they only show the negatives of Hambantota, where families have been affected by the nature around the elephant attacks. But I feel like they can show the positive impacts of Hambantota and help bring in foreign investments, where we will be able to help our economy grow back to normal.
Yes, actually, with regards to Hambantota, it is one of the most developed infrastructure-wise. It is very developed. There's lots of roads, highways, airports, harbours. One of the largest airports and harbours in Sri Lanka. So it is a place that we can bring in lots of investment. That's what you're trying to say, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
So,
But then the media doesn't show this opportunity to the people. They don't show this is a very good place for investment. They don't show that. What do they say? They are saying it's wasteful infrastructure spending. So I'm not going to talk about whether it's wasteful or not. But now that we have it, we already have the investment. So why don't we talk about how we can bring in income from that instead of just complaining about how it's wasteful expenditure and pointless investments? They always try to present that view because that's what excites the people and
Yes.
invokes criticism and gets clicks and views.
Yes, and if you take the geographical location of Hambantota into consideration, it's positioned at the bottom, at the southernmost point of the country, and it's on one of the most traveled shipping routes in the world. And if properly exploited, Hambantota can become like the next Singapore. And the fact that mass media is portraying the infrastructure developments in Hambantota as a wasteful investment of money, it's not appropriate.
Yes, actually I saw an article where there was a plan to develop Hambantota as a transshipment hub because currently there's a lot of ships going from Singapore to India to the Middle East and Europe, right? So those ships currently dock at Indian ports for repairs and supplies and things like that. So there's a plan to bring in those ships to Sri Lanka because that would be a closer route and it would be less expensive for those ships. So if we can develop Hambantota as a transshipment route, that could be very beneficial for Sri Lanka. But what is everyone saying? Everyone's saying this is a waste of expenditure, empty ports, loss making, and selling the country to China. That's what they say, right?
Exactly. And if you look at the sources of income of the country, our main source of income are exports, such as raw material exports, right? Tea, rubber, coconut, and
about tourism as well.
tourism, and then remittances. But then if we diversify our exports, our sources of income, we most probably wouldn't have been in this crisis right now. Because if we had developed our technological industry, and if we had developed our transshipment industry by developing areas such as Hambantota, we could have brought in a significant amount of income, which would not have been affected most probably by the COVID-19 virus.
Yes, I think the COVID-19 virus had a big impact on us, on our economy, because of the fact that we are heavily invested in a limited range of income sources. So for example, when tourism fell, we were heavily affected, but as you were saying, if we expanded and diversified into different regions, then that could have been avoided. That's what you're saying, right? Yeah.
So also we can talk about the Kantale sugar factory, which was closed down back in 1991. It was one of the main income sources for the Sri Lankan government back in the day, but due to administration issues in the board of directors and management, it had to close down in 1999. But I think if the government can reinvest in the factory and then bring it back into position where it was, I think it'll increase our economy because we can export a lot and we can stop the import of sugar. But then our government has been talking about the negativities of it. They've always spoken about how costly it is, but I think the cost of it is worth, because in the long run, when you export, you get a huge amount of foreign currency to Sri Lanka. So I think it's one of the best things that the government has to implement.
Yeah, actually, as you were saying, Sri Lanka has a lot of idle resources, such as the Kantale sugar factory. And these are resources that we can utilize to actually earn an income for the government. Like currently, the only way of earning income for the government is through taxes, right? So of course, the government needs income, and for that they need to tax the people. But if they could develop alternative sources of income, for example, the Kantale sugar factory, if they could develop that into a profit-making enterprise, then the need for taxes would also be reduced, because they'll be changing their revenue streams to different sources, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So if the media could also, instead of simply complaining about problems, if they could also show solutions, how we could overcome this crisis, maybe that could also motivate the government and politicians to actually implement these things, because If the media talks about why is there something like this that is being wasted, why is there an idle resource, why isn't the government doing anything about this, then the public, the common general public, they will also want to know why there is nothing being done about this.
Questions.
They will also implement pressure onto the government. So this could force the government to actually take the right decisions.
Questions are going to arise among people. As you said,
people will have questions and
why,
they'll demand answers. Why is this just being idle? Why isn't the government
why
doing
these resources are not utilized properly. So
clearly the media has a very important role in shaping the opinions of people.
Yes, and as you said, in regards of idle resources, so Sri Lanka is one of the few countries in which public utilities are not privatized, and during the recent months, privatization processes have taken place where public companies have the government has tried to privatize them, but then the media always shows the negative side of privatization. They show the trade unions' reactions to privatization, but then they don't try to bring on business people or someone with a knowledge of an appropriate knowledge of business who can actually show the effects, the positive effects of privatization.
Yeah, if you look at like the current situation of the country, like most of our state-owned enterprises are loss-making. They are a huge cost to the government, right? So in the short run, right now, because of this situation, we might need to sell off these assets to actually earn some income, right? So, but then what happens when you try to, for example, privatize CPETCO, the Ceylon Electricity Board? Obviously, trade unions will start protesting against this because the workers will lose their jobs. But what does the media do? The media always shows these protesters protesting, and they'll try to base it in a way like we are trying to sell off the country, sell off the national resources of this country, but they don't show how this could benefit the country, selling this off, right?
Right. So instead of showing protests, would it not be better if certain media organizations try to bring protesters and certain public policymakers together to engage in debate and dialogue and to debate the policies together? Because obviously protesting on the street and implementing policies in government, they do not go together, right? Because no agreement can be made. They don't go together, they don't come together, they don't engage in dialogue, and they don't argue. So as media is defined, it's supposed to show true information to people. So it should be where people can come together and engage in dialogue and show the best side of what can be.
Yeah, actually, if we look at protests and things like that, conflicts of interest, like there are protesters on one side protesting and government officials on another side. And of course, they also have dialogue between the two parties to try and come to an agreement, but the media does not see that, the public doesn't see that. So the public doesn't get an idea of who they should support, whether they should support the protesters, whether they should support the government, why they should support any side. They don't get any idea about this. So I think currently a lot of mainstream media outlets have programs like Derana Tunziyata, Hiru Salakuna. They have programs where they bring in certain people to discuss policies. Don't you think it would be a good idea if they could bring in like conflicting parties together in one program where they could discuss their policies, why they think this is better, and then the public can eventually get a good idea of who they should support in this conflict?
Yes, absolutely. So even although there are a few programs which bring in conflicting parties, they don't always engage in proper political or economical sort of dialogues, right? Because it's always either biased, it's always partially biased, I would say, because most media outlets, they focus on promoting a certain political point of view, and rather than showing the truth to the people, they try to express their political opinions over the actual truth.
Yeah, actually media is supposed to be unbiased and neutral, but I think it's impossible for anyone to be completely unbiased. Like when they're showing a story, they'll obviously try to frame it in a particular way. Like even in Sri Lanka, media organizations, they're aligned with different political views. So don't you think this is true, that it is completely impossible for someone to be completely neutral?
So here, like as he said before, media units bring in politicians, right? Politicians and other persons. So what I think is like as you said, they should bring in protesters and politicians together. So therefore, we can make conflicting, and also they may be able to find solutions then and there itself. So I think they should do that, and also when they bring in these politicians to these media units, they only talk about how the protests, how what has gone wrong in the past. Instead, I think they should talk about how they can make a change in the future, and how can they can implement better policies in the future, and also as you said before, being neutral,
Completely unbiased.
yeah, completely unbiased. I don't think that's possible because people do have views, right, and their own views, their own opinions. So they should be able to stick to their opinions as well. So
Yeah, I agree. Like, for example, there's always two sides to a story. So it is every person has their own unique view. So they naturally align with a particular view. So they try to, even when they're broadcasting the news, they leave with, I don't know whether they purposely do it, but they naturally try to tell the news in a way that aligns with their view. So I think it's technically impossible for someone to be completely unbiased and neutral. So what can we do about this?
Right. So as he said, most media corporations, they're stuck on the past, right? So they bring in politicians and they talk about what has gone wrong. They talk about the past. They talk about what went wrong in the past instead of trying to fix the future. So for example, recently in Hiru Salukana, they brought on Dhammika Perera. It was actually refreshing to see the comparison between him and most politicians, almost all politicians, right? They lack a certain framework, but Dhammika Perera, he was able to give, he brought on a complete list of policies that could be changed to increase the foreign remittances and the source of income into the country, and that is what I believe that media should be promoting. Instead of bringing on politicians and discussing politics and playing their political game, they should be focused on developing the country and providing a framework for the growth of this country.
Yeah, but as you said a politician should be focused on developing the country. But to do that, they should actually come into power, right? And whether we like it or not, the sad truth is, to do that, they might have to manipulate the opinions of people, and some people might say the end justifies the means. So if you actually eventually come to power and make a change, then the path to coming to power, if you manipulate people, if you play political games, as you said, they might inevitably have to do that.
Yes, absolutely true. But then there's a time and place for everything, right? So for a political game can be played in the government, in the parliament, or during a campaign. But then when you come onto a certain program which is directed towards providing an economic framework for the development of the country, for example, Hiru Salukana, they're on a 360. What they do is they try to provide people with an insight of what actually happens in the government, what these lawmakers and what these political personnel, what happens in the government. So it's not always a game of politics. I think that there should be a place and a time and place for everything. And when you come into certain programs like that, you should be prepared with a framework, because if it's all politics and if you walk the walk, if you talk the talk but you don't walk the walk, then there's no point, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. For example, in communist China, there was a leader called Deng Xiaoping. So to come to power in communist China, within the party, you have to obviously cater to the communist views. You have to show that you are a true communist. But once he came to power, he was the person who actually liberalized China by bringing in new policies that helped China to grow economically. So something that he said was, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. So what he meant by that was, it doesn't matter if his policies are communist or capitalist, as long as at the end of the day, it develops the country, which is what he needs to do. So he forgot party politics and he did what he needed to do. So I think that's what you were trying to say, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's not always. So for example, even in Sri Lanka, when most even economic policies, they change as the government changes. This does not happen in other countries. For example, in the US, the central bank is completely separate from the government, right? So if you have an economic framework that works, then that should be implemented regardless of what party is in power. and that starts with the government, where they separate the power from the ministers and they give it down to obviously the governor, of the officials of the central bank, who are more to a certain level more competent in such aspects, right? So if you can't have a stable framework in a country if the economic policies change like this with the government, and especially in a country such as ours, which does not have a stable government as of now, then if the economic framework is not in place for, say, the next 5-10 years, then how can we have hope for growth if there's no framework for people to look forward to?
Yes, actually, I think this is a very relevant point to Sri Lanka, because throughout our history, our governments have been changing and policies have been changing. Like, for example, during Mrs. Sirima Bandaranaike's time, there were a lot of socialist policies enacted. But as soon as President J.R. Jayawardena came to power in 1970s, late 1970s, he opened the market. He made it a free market, and that drastically changed how the economy of the country operated. And even during President Mahinda Rajapaksa's time, the country was focused on economic development through infrastructure development. Like, he built a lot of roads, harbours, and started a lot of projects. But after the government changed, these projects were not continued. They were set aside and allowed to just rot. So that's a huge waste of expenditure if plans are not carried out.
So, as Dinura said before, he said that when government changes, hierarchy of different departments do change. I think it should be the same, because it shouldn't be the same, sorry. I think they should be allowed to stay even though the government changes. Because one thing, for example, Port City. So back in 2005, when Mahinda Rajapaksa came into power, his plan was to develop Port City. And when after his rule, when Maithripala Sirisena came into power, they did stop Port City for about 1 to 2 years. So that was because of the change in policies, right? I think that shouldn't have been the case. If it was there, if they did not stop it, there would have been high potential to at least complete stage 1 of Port City. Whereas they could have brought in a lot of investments, foreign investments as well, because people want to invest,
Yeah, that mindset of politicians must change, because when a new government comes to power, what they're trying to do is they're always trying to discredit the previous government, because they're trying to say that those people's policies were wrong. That is why they're in this problem. So to do that, they put aside their policies, they stop their projects, they stop the development of their projects to show that their projects are failures.
So basically, as you said, in a simple word, they do take something like, not exactly, but something like revenge from
political victimization.
Political victimization. So I think that has to stop. We have to have a practical mindset.
So as he said before, those are political games they're playing even after they come to power.
That's
so after a government comes to power, I believe they should just forget politics and work on developing the country, enforcing their economic policies, their
betterment of our country,
policies that they gave out in their election promises. So what they're always trying to do is trying to retain power, and to do that they'll have to discredit the opposition, obviously, to prevent the opposition from coming back to power. So that's what they do. I think this mindset should be changed.
Absolutely. So if you look at countries such as France, the president of France, who was recently re-elected for his second term, Mr. Emmanuel Macron, he has a cabinet of ministers who are from different parties. So it's not always trying to promote. He's not always trying to promote his party. He's trying to work towards the development of the country, and that's one of the reasons that France has seen such exponential growth in recent years. Obviously, they have their shortcomings, but then there has been a significant positive growth in the country under his leadership, and I think that's what all leaders should aspire to be, where they push aside the political aims to a certain extent and try to focus on the development of the country, because leaders are appointed to develop the country, not to promote themselves.
I think especially at a time like this, the government should try to get the best people from all parties to come to work together. Forget party politics, forget political alliances and things like that. Come together to work to develop the country. Get the best people for the best job.
But have you come across people taking for granted. Some leaders, they do actually work for the betterment of especially Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi from Libya. I think they did work for the betterment, but then their people took the rule for granted at one point, and then they did want to eliminate both leaders.
I think that is also, the media played a key role in that, because Saddam Hussein's invasion, if you look at Iraq then and now, Iraq used to be a very developed country, high standard of living, but at that time Western media propagated a claim that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, the mostly British media, because they wanted to invade Iraq and kill Saddam. So, but if you look at British people then and now, their opinions, at that time most people supported the invasion of Iraq because they actually believed that they had weapons of mass destruction. But after the Western forces entered Iraq, they couldn't find anything. And now I saw that a recent survey that was conducted, people regret sending the army to Iraq because it's a pointless war, right? Because now look at the state of Iraq. There's ISIS he has a stronghold there. Terrorism is very common, and it's a dismantled nation.
It was just a waste of resources back
Waste
then.
of resources, and now the country is entirely destroyed.
They could have had much more potential if they did not, if media portrayed the positive impact of those countries. They could have had much more potential. They could have brought in they could have set an example to underdeveloped countries.
Yeah, I saw a video by a Western media outlet, I think it was BBC. In that video, an Iraqi person, he's saying, back then even I went to topple Saddam's statue. I was part of the people who broke down Saddam's statue, but now I wish he was here, because when he was here the situation was so much better. So I think media has a key role. At that time they portrayed him as a bad person, an evil dictator who had weapons of mass destruction. But now even Western media is showing how Iraq was better under him. But at the same time, media also has a very positive impact. For example, the organic fertilizer issue in Sri Lanka.
Oh yes. So during the fertilizer issue, the fertilizer crisis in Sri Lanka, which was at the beginning of all this economic downfall, right? So during that time, certain media outlets, they took the trouble, actually, they took a positive outlook, and they encouraged people to grow crops in their homes. They showed people farmers especially, who growed organic crops without relying on chemical fertilizer.
Yeah, so that's an example of, instead of simply showing the problem, they try to show a solution too. They try to get people to grow something in their own gardens. So the media was doing a very positive thing at that time. So even during COVID pandemic, they did a lot of things to raise awareness. For example, wearing masks, using sanitizer, keeping social distancing. They did a lot of things to raise awareness too, right?
Yes, I think they did raise awareness, but I have to disagree with you on that, because I think that what they did was they propagated the issue. They propagated the issue out of
magnitude.
Yes, they increased the magnitude of the problem than it actually was, because what they did was they showed people dying continuously.
You're saying they magnified the issue, made it bigger than it was.
Yes, they magnified the issue, and then they showed the number of deaths. Day after day after day, they showed the number of increase in deaths. And what they didn't show was that, to a certain extent, this was not such a big issue, because the people who were actually caught in the pandemic and who were dying were actually people who were either in their old age or people who are already suffering from health issues.
Yeah, at that time we thought the COVID pandemic was a very dangerous thing, and we were all very scared. We had lockdowns. Even if there was one patient, we had a lockdown, right? But now it's not such a big thing anymore. It's like a normal virus. Is that what you're trying to say?
That's what I'm trying to say.
But I do disagree with you to a certain extent, but I think at that time also they did not show the legitimate values of death tolls also, but I think they should, because you know why? People, when they know the actual death tolls and all the legit statistics, I think they would be better, like they would be more secure.
Be more prepared.
Exactly, more prepared, and they'll be ready to face whatever it is, and therefore we can that may decrease the impact on people. Get it?
Yeah.
So
Yes, so we can also talk about, you were talking about how they might tell wrong facts and figures, but now that we have social media, a lot of social media sites and YouTube channels like Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, a lot of YouTube news channels also, there's vloggers, there's people who try to tell their side of the story to the world.
But,
so, because there's lots of people popping up like that, lots of independent reporters popping up like mushrooms. You could say now people have a better idea of what's going on, less misinformation.
yeah, less misinformation too. But then there is this thing as well. YouTube channels and mass media, they show different values, right? They don't show the same exact value. I think they should not do that, because that makes confusion in people's minds, where it can lead to a bigger disaster than it is.
Yeah, but what you're trying to say is they should show the same thing. But what if
Exactly.
that same thing is wrong? What if media is showing a wrong figure and there are social media activists showing the correct figure? Shouldn't the people, don't they have the right to know the truth?
Yeah, they do. But then these people, like YouTubers and vloggers, they do not provide detailed statistics. They just provide the value, right?
You're saying they're not
Yeah.
regulated by
They are not
anybody.
regulated. So they just show the single value, just the number of dead tours. But I think they should just show the detailed ones. Like, then they have a better understanding on what's going on, what's happening, and
Yeah.
they do have enough information to believe it's legit.
If you forget like this issue in particular and look at a wider perspective, I think the fact that we have a lot of YouTube channels, a lot of information on Twitter and Facebook, I think that's a very good thing, because people get to know, they don't have to rely on mainstream media. They have a lot of different sources of information. They're not boxed into what they are fed. They can see for themselves what's happening.
Yes, but I also think that with the development of social media, there's been the viral factor, right? Because where information can quickly pass around, and that can have its downsides. That has its downsides, right? Because, for example, during the recent protests in Sri Lanka, we saw that social media was bombarded by videos and
a lot of people followed the trend.
right? So actually it led to more damage than good in those times, right? Because people were drawn towards
Using attraction.
using it as an attraction, and in a way I would go so far as to say that social media propagated violence in the country.
I completely agree. Social media at that time completely propagated violence, because it started instigating violence, because people started seeing a lot of videos out of context, taken out of context, a lot of wrong facts and figures propagated by these YouTube channels. So people got angry, people got violent, and that created a lot of chaos and harm in the country.
Absolutely.
They fumed as you said before, all these values did fume people, and then there was the people took public property into granted, right? For example, I saw there was a painting which was worth millions at the president's house, which was just tarnished. So I think if that was not the case, if people, like, news showed the positive impact and like all the legit values, I think they could have stopped it. They could have not let these things happen.
Yeah, there's also a thing called mob mentality. Like when a person is alone, the way he thinks is different from when he's surrounded by his people. Like when a person is alone, he might think more sensibly and do proper act in an appropriate manner. But when he's surrounded by a lot of people who think the same way, people who are angry, then they might take actions that they might later regret. For example, if you're surrounded by a lot of people in a protest who are angry, they might start attacking policemen, start destroying public property. But if that person was alone, they'd be more sensible. They wouldn't have that mob mentality. I think these social media influencers, social media sites, these videos, I think they add to the mob mentality.
Yes, absolutely, and
They reinforce it.
yes,
They
and
reinforce it.
I think one of the significant causes which led to such violence in the country is that the people who are violent, they too had a platform, and the violence actually took much more. It went viral very quickly, right? So because, for example, videos of these people entering houses and destroying private property and public property, it went viral within minutes. And what this did was, because it wasn't regulated, it encouraged more people to resort to violence, like you said, because people were angry, right? They did not have food, they couldn't feed themselves, the prices were skyrocketing.
Yeah, but they thought this would, expressing the anger in this way would solve their problems. That's what they thought, because they were surrounded by the mob mentality.
Yes, and actually it didn't lead to anything.
And also there was this other thing where they made the protests into a business. So people, I saw this one video where was this influencer which took in money from people, like not foreign people, Sri Lankan people who are living abroad, and then he took it into his account instead of using that for a better cause, for the benefit of the people. So I think people like publishing wrong information may like it'll bring in bad impact. And also, as I said before, businesses they'll take it into an opportunity where they can earn money instead of doing the right thing. So yeah, I think
this brings us back to the fact that those things are not regulated. They can say and do whatever they want, so they can defraud people. But I also believe that people have a responsibility to educate themselves instead of just blindly following someone. If there are sites that provide factual information, statistics, facts, hard facts, I think they'll be able to educate themselves and not fall into these traps, because that eventually leads to the education level of people. Like they might say Sri Lanka has the highest literacy rate, one of the highest literacy rates in Sri Lanka, in South Asia. But that doesn't mean we are educated. Just because a person can read something, that might actually have an adverse effect. Like if you see a poster that could be completely misleading, a person would read it, right, because we have high literacy rates, but when they read it, they would not understand the actual thing that's going on. So I think the high literacy rates we have could also be a disadvantage, because high literacy doesn't necessarily mean good education levels. So people have a responsibility to, educated people have a responsibility to understand what's actually going on. So I think the fact that we have YouTube channels, social media influencers, access to a wide range of opinions, the fact that a lot of people are given a platform to voice their opinions, is a good thing, because people can see, then they can see both sides of the story, right?
Absolutely, because if you have a high, like you said, having a high literacy rate does not translate to having a more educated or emotionally intelligent population, right? Because you could just read something and completely misconstrue the words which have been said. So if you don't have the capacity to actually understand and take the essence of what you're reading, then I think being literate is in itself pointless.
Yeah, so the fact that there are a lot of channels and a lot of different views is actually a good thing. So of course there's a lot more to talk about this topic. Media is a very wide topic, a lot of things to talk about. But time is running out, so shall we end this conversation?
Okay.
Thank you for being here today.